Welcome to the 128th season of the Canadian Club Toronto, Canada's Podium. For over a century, this platform has been a gathering place for visionaries, public figures, and decision makers to discuss the most pressing issues of our time.
We've been having important discussions and debates around this podium in this country for well over a century. I call this a historic podium of record.
Our club's always been a forum for visionaries, public figures, and decision makers to command attention to the issues of our time.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to those joining us online. We are glad that you are able to join us here today. My name is Karen Rustool, a Canadian Club Toronto director and your host for today's conversation. Today's topic hits close to home for me, speaking about Indian residential schools and the untold numbers of missing children, unmarked graves, and burial sites that have long been hidden for much too long. It is part of our collective history, and our truth and reconciliation journey requires us to do hard things, to talk about the darker shades of our shared history, even with those who may have a hard time processing these truths and realities, while also recognizing that, as Joanna Barron, a leading Canadian constitutional lawyer, put it in her July 2023 article at the Hub Canada, the solution to ignorance and prejudice in a free society can never be censorship. I'm proud to be part of a club that is not afraid to tackle the uncomfortable. That's what we do at Canada's Podium. Tackle matters of policy and law, matters of business, and matters of truth. As we will hear today, truths that have been hidden for far too long and deserve to be shared and acknowledged by Canadians everywhere. We value our supporters and sponsors deeply, so let me acknowledge them now. Today's event sponsors, Borden Ladner Gervais. Thank you for supporting today's event. Our online sponsor today is TD Bank. Thank you for ensuring that today's event is free for everyone online. Making today's conversation accessible to Canadians across the country. The Canadian Bankers Association is our season sponsor, and Air Canada is our official airline sponsor. For the third year in a row, we are partnering with Canada's Forest Trust to reduce our carbon footprint by planting and stewarding a forest in our honor. Thank you for your ongoing generosity. The club is pleased to support members of the University of Toronto's Political Science Department who are here today. Welcome. Do a little clap. Where are they in the room? And before I introduce our guest speaker, I need to draw your attention to a few housekeeping matters. It's always my favorite part of the talk. We have quite a few events this month, so please visit our website at canadianclub.org. You can have access to our events on demand, and membership information is also available online for those who haven't joined our club yet. Please also help us spread the word on your social media platforms. We really do appreciate you drawing attention to the important speakers and topics that we host here at the club. If you have a question for a guest speaker today, question and answer cards are on your table. This is what they look like. Don't be afraid to exercise them. Colleen, our wonderful executive director, I don't know if she's in the room right now, but she does a good job at running around collecting them. and bringing them up on stage so that we can all be part of the conversation. For those joining remotely, thanks to TD once again, please hit the Submit a Question button on the right side of your screen. All right. Today we welcome the Independent Special Interlocutor for Missing Children and Unmarked Graves and Burial Sites, Kimberly Murray, who began this hard and important work more than 2 years ago. A Kanesatake Mohawk Nation member, Kim has dedicated her career to supporting Indigenous peoples and communities, always with a view to seeking justice. Her legal training has served her well in this regard, whether it was her leadership role at Aboriginal Legal Services of Toronto or her role as Executive Director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. At the TRC, she worked tirelessly to ensure that Indian residential school system survivors were heard and remembered. This is a responsibility that Kimberly continued on in her current role. As the province's first ever Assistant Deputy Attorney General for Indigenous Justice, a role she held for 6 years, her focus was on community justice. Prior to her interlocutor role, Kimberly led efforts to recover the missing children and unmarked burials as executive lead for the Survivors Secretariat at the Six Nations of the Grand River. She is widely respected for her leadership, and her numerous awards are a testament to that. Moderating the conversation today is our beloved Canadian Club Toronto President, Tanya Van Biesen, who serves as the CEO of Versify, which is formerly Women in Capital Markets. Kimberly and Tanya, Canada's podium is now yours.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon, everybody. Kimberly, a real honor to have you here with us today.
Thank you. My honor to be here.
Thank you. And we do really encourage everyone to ask questions. As Karen said, we will be collecting them throughout. We will also be monitoring the live stream. So if you have questions, please do not hesitate to put them forward. But Kimberly and I will kick off the conversation. This is also, oddly, perhaps a very important conversation for me because my adopted brother-in-law died by, well, whether it was suicide or not, we will never know, but at the age of 25 in Vancouver. And he was adopted into his family, but came from actually several members of his family, immediate and extended, were residential school attendees and not all survivors.
Yeah, sorry to hear that.
Yeah, well, thank you for being here. So I think maybe you can set the context for us. What was your mandate when you were asked to do this work, and what was the context of that mandate?
I think everyone remembers when Kamloops announced the 215 recovery of what they believed to be unmarked burials. And Canada immediately, when that announcement was made, said that they were going to appoint a special interlocutor for missing children and unmarked graves. It took them over a year to develop the mandate, meeting with Indigenous leadership, in particular Kupi Casimir and Chief from Cowessess First Nation, Cadmus Delorme, because Cowessess, almost immediately after Kamloops announced the over 700 graves that are associated with the Indian Residential School in Cowessess. And so it was the Department of Justice who appointed me, the federal minister, Attorney General of Canada, and I was asked to identify the barriers that communities are facing in relation to the laws that we have in the country, for them to do the searches, to do the ground searches, to do the archival research that's needed, to be able to heal and commemorate the burials, to memorialize the children. We know in the country we don't have national law to help communities do this type of work. And so, you know, I got that call from the Department of Justice asking me if I would take the position on. I did not know what an interlocutor was. That law degree that I got from Osgood did not teach me what an interlocutor was. I had to Google it. I had to see if we ever had an interlocutor before in the country, and we did for Métis rights, Indian Affairs, as it then was called. And then I had to really think about whether I wanted to accept this appointment. And it took a lot of conversations with friends. Some of them are in the room today. And thank you for that. And elders and survivors. And, that's when I came to the realization that I have to take this position, that it was an obligation that I had. It felt like a duty to continue the work that we had started at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on the missing and what I now call disappeared Indigenous children.
You had an interim report that you released, and now you've just released your final report. Can you share with us some of the key findings in your report?
There's many, but I was required to release an interim report, and specifically in the mandate, I was asked to identify common concerns. That's the language that's in the mandate. And so when I released the interim report in June of 2023, I identified 12 common concerns that communities are facing. And, they're not going to be a surprise to people in the room here. Funding was a problem that communities were facing. Denialism was a problem that they were facing. Access to technology, access to the experts that know how to use the technology. There were a lot of companies that were coming forward saying they had expertise in ground penetrating radar, that they knew how to analyze the data for unmarked burials, and they didn't. They were companies that knew how to look for pipes in the ground or utility lines. So I identified the 12 common concerns, and that's in the interim report. And then last week, I released, I released another report in the summer called Sites of Truth, Sites of Conscience. That's when I was extended. My mandate was for 2 years, and I got extended for an extra 6 months. Canada doesn't like me to say it's 6 months extension. They just wanted me to say into the fall, but my mandate goes to December 12th. I think they want me to quit before December 12th. But my OIC goes to December 12th. When they were extending the mandate so we could finish the final report and get the French translation done and the writing completed, I decided I would release 3 of the chapters that were going to be the first 3 chapters of the report, and I made it its own book. Called Sites of Truth, Sites of Conscience. And that report is meant to show the evidence of the genocide and the crimes against humanity that happened to the children. It builds on the TRC's Volume 4 on missing children and unmarked burials. But what I wanted to do was show the documents, show the images, the photographs. Many of the documents that I have in that report were cited by the TRC, but you would have to be maybe part of U of T history research department where you would go to the site, the footnote, the endnote, and actually go to the archive and look at the document yourself. I wanted to make it easier for Canadians to see the evidence, to read for themselves those letters where, the principal says, the cemetery's full. We're now burying the kids across the road. I wanted people to see the death certificates that say the child's buried in the Indian Residential School Cemetery. I wanted Canadians to see the photographs, and that was a very difficult decision to make, whether to put photographs of kids in cemeteries. But the elders that I worked with, the survivors I worked with, said, it's time. We have to show these to help put a stop to the denialism. So that came out in July, and I encourage everyone to read that volume. I also identified the other institutions that kids were transferred to. The Indian hospitals, the TB sanatoriums, homes for unwed mothers, the Good Shepherd's Home, where the same policy applied by the government. If the child died there, their parents weren't told and they weren't sent home. And they were buried either on cemeteries on the institutional grounds or in nearby municipal cemeteries. And they are in unmarked graves, and they are in mass graves. I went to the Prospect Cemetery, I don't know which direction I'm facing, the Prospect Cemetery right here in Toronto. There's a child buried in a mass grave with 18 other children. And that family can't exhume their loved one to bring them home. And they had been sent down here from the north. That is all over the country. There's these unmarked burials. And so last week I released my final report. It's long. I encourage you to read the executive summary first. I identified 42 obligations. People that know me well, I often don't do what I'm told to do. I was supposed to make recommendations, and I decided I would identify obligations because we know recommendations often don't get implemented by government. So the whole report is grounded in international human rights law and international conventions, identifying the legal, moral, and ethical obligations that Canada as a country have for reparations for Indigenous people. I heard in the last 2.5 years that the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was not full reparations. There are many institutions excluded from the settlement agreement. Communities and families were not compensated for their children dying in these institutions. They were not compensated for their community members not being returned home for proper burials. Our apology from the Prime Minister at the time, Stephen Harper, there's one line in that apology about kids that died in the institutions. So the final report sets out the Indigenous-led reparation framework that I heard from survivors and Indigenous communities and their families about what they believe is needed for there to be full reparations for Indigenous people in this country.
I can only imagine how many people you've spoken to and the stories that you've heard. Would you share some of the stories that maybe have stayed with you?
Wow. So, I spent the last 2.5 years going across the country, being invited. So I only went where I was invited. I held 6 national gatherings, 7 if you count last week. And we really wanted to, and I want to recognize many of my team that worked with me for the last 2 years are sitting at the table, Wendy and Julie and Tom and Kirsten. We really wanted to so we held these gatherings, and the whole purpose of the gatherings was to create safe spaces for community members to speak about the work that they're doing, the very sacred work of looking for the burials, and to hear from the survivors as well. A lot of the things we also had heard during the TRC days, but we were also seeing more survivors coming forward that didn't speak to the TRC because they weren't ready yet. And then we were hearing from family members who this search for your missing loved one is like an intergenerational search, passed on from the grandparent, from the mother to their children to the niece and the nephew, where they're looking 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years to find where their loved one's buried. And so it was really important that we had that safe space where people came together. And then I went to many communities and walked the sites of the burial grounds, participated in ceremonies, went to burial sites with family members that we had helped find their missing family member, where they, did their ceremonies, put down the, tobacco and the medicines that they do, and those moments I'll always carry those in my heart. to just see that you could help in that small way to bring peace to that family. But we have so much more to do. Like, there are families that are trying to bring their child home, and Canada won't pay to exhume the body and won't pay to bring the child home if they didn't die in the Indian residential school that's recognized under the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. And so those kids that were transferred and died in the hospitals and the TB sanatoriums and the homes for unwed mothers, there's no one to help. There's no organization, institution, government funding to help them bring their children home.
Now, the government has not yet responded to your report, have they?
No.
No. And should we expect a response?
I'm hoping to receive a response. Maybe we can all keep calling the minister and ask him what his response is. It is a 2,000-page report, and I did not give them an embargoed copy. They were driving me crazy asking for an embargoed copy, but I knew even if they had an embargoed copy, they would still say the same thing: we're going to study this report and we'll let you know later. So, in fairness to the government, they have to take some time to read the report. But I'm hopeful that, there's some of the 42 obligations that they feel that they can implement immediately. For example, continuing the funding for communities, making sure it's sustainable and long-term. That's an easy thing that they can do and they can come out and commit to tomorrow.
Let's talk a little bit about, there's been controversy around the report or some of what you've advocated for. And so let's just talk about this whole issue of denialism. Mm-hmm. What's your view of that? Of course, Leah Gazan is advocating that this be now a crime to deny the harms of Indigenous residential schools, Indian residential schools. So talk to us about that.
Yeah. So denialism has been around this country for a very long time around the residential schools. When I worked at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with Murray, Sinclair, and the commissioners, we had the same issue. We had the same thing happening with emails and people attacking the TRC, saying it's not true, only good things happen in these institutions, and people putting out disinformation, purposely putting out false information, or relying on information where they'll say, I used this as an example the other day on the radio. Look at this person. He was taken to Indian residential school and then became the premier of a territory. See, they were good places because he would never have been the premier if he hadn't gone to Indian residential school, which is just BS. Right? Like, to isolate someone's resilience and resistance and, how they came through the horrific crimes that happened to them, the sexual, physical, emotional, spiritual abuse, and then to say it was a good thing because you've succeeded in life. Right. So this has been happening for a long time. We see people taking photographs of the archival photographs where the kids are smiling. Like, see, it must have been a good place. They're all smiling. But when you speak to survivors, they talk about those visits, those government visitors that come and how they had to be put in their best clothes and how they had to sit and behave and smile for the photos. I called out the media in my final report around the propaganda that they've contributed to around the Indian residential schools. And I'm grateful that CBC is doing a review of their archives and are hopefully going to issue an apology one day for the way they've depicted Indian residential schools in the history. So there's a difference between denial and denialism, right? If you can say, I don't believe there's burials, right? You can have that opinion. But then if you're going to try and incite hate against Indigenous people, that's the bill that Leah Gazan is putting forward. It's about inciting hate. So you can say, I don't believe there's burials, But then you can't go on and say, I don't believe there's burials, and I think all the Indians are lying to get money from the government and to get their people to burn down churches and to take your cottages away. That is inciting hate against a group of people. And that's what we have to stop. I write about some of the communities where people showed up with shovels, wanting to dig up the graves. We have...
To prove that they weren't there?
To prove that they weren't there. We have, there's a video on YouTube of 2 men that went into the Allen Memorial Garden Site Institute where a search was happening, and on a former Mohawk village, and dug up artifacts and took them, and were digging to see if they could find human remains. We don't have a law to protect the ancestors of Indigenous people in this country, and I write about that in the report. People say if we have this provision in the criminal code making it an offense to incite hate against Indigenous people, the language that Leah Gazan is proposing mirrors the language that is in the criminal code to deny the Holocaust as well. It's never been challenged in court. Lots of lawyers in the room. We all know there's a careful balancing that happens by the court between the different charter rights. But we know inciting hate is not protected as free speech. Mm-hmm. So I support that bill, and I called on Canada in my interim report and in my final report to implement some sanctions.
This issue, which seemed to has attracted a lot of attention, does it risk taking away from the work that you've done, right? Does it create this swirl over here when really the eye should be drawn here?
Yeah, I mean, when I released my interim report, I was a little taken aback that most of the media just focused on the denialism. And that's happening as well with the final report. I mean, there's so many more important things in the report that Canadians need to be aware of. I talk about settler amnesty that we have in this country. And the way I explain it to survivors and to the elders is how Canada has protected itself from any kind of accountability for the crimes against humanity and genocide it's committed. And I identify all the ways it has done that, starting with the Convention Against Genocide and not applying the definition of what is genocide in our criminal code. They've removed three articles, transferring from one group to another. That's not in our criminal code. All the things that Canada would have put itself at risk of being held accountable for Indian residential schools, it removed. In our crimes against humanity, it did not include enforced disappearances in our legislation. So there's a big long list. It hasn't signed on to the Convention Against Enforced Disappearances. It hasn't signed on to the American Convention of Human Rights, which opens up an avenue for communities and survivors to seek some kind of a justice and accountability. Everywhere I went, survivors and community members talked about how there hasn't been any justice or accountability. The settlement agreement wasn't about justice and accountability. And so with this final report, I wanted to give some, I'm a lawyer, so I said to the writers, some of them are in the room, I said I want us to build the case for communities to be able to take it further, whether it's in the at the UN, to be able to put pressure on the federal government so that we could have proper reparations according to international standards.
We have a business audience here, so some may be asking themselves, is the reason why Canada just continually tries to stay away from this is because of what it will cost the country. So can you comment on that?
I don't know. Canada spends a lot of money fighting Indigenous people as opposed to supporting Indigenous people. We spend a lot of money building these institutions.
Yep.
Even during the Depression, right? The Depression happens. We have Indian residential schools. Some of them get burnt down, but we found the money to rebuild them. You know, when Canada wants to support what it wants to support, it finds the money. I think it's more about protecting its international reputation as being a human rights abiding society, which is very difficult to do when we look internally at all the human rights breaches that have happened and continue to happen, but in particular in Indian residential schools and these other institutions.
How have Indigenous leaders, elders, the communities, how have they reacted to your work?
Well, so when I released my report, it was at a gathering, and for those that were watching online or came to the release of the report, I actually met with the people that were at the gathering in the morning, and I gave them a preview of what I was going to be showing. What I was going to be saying. And I've been speaking at survivor gatherings for 2 years, and I've been foreshadowing what I was going to say. And I really wanted to capture the voices of community in the report. So they've been very supportive. Indigenous leadership, the national chief was at my gathering and said she supports the 42 obligations. Nathan Obed, the president of ITK, the Inuit National Indian Organization, supported it, Native Women's Association. So I'm hoping as they have their assemblies that they'll be putting forward resolutions and fighting, just like they're doing with the calls to action and the MMIWG, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Call for Justice, to add these. And I just want to say, I had the great honor of having a dinner at the Governor General's house during my mandate, where she invited commissioners from other public inquiries and inquiries of the sort that I was doing. And the whole dinner conversation was about how do we get the recommendations implemented? What worked for your commission, what didn't work? And Commissioner Wilton Littlechild was there, and he had run a commission before he was the commissioner at the TRC, and he's like, less is better, Kim, less is better in the number of recommendations. And so we had a whole bunch more recommendations, that a big long list, a big long laundry list. But you know, I really reflected on what Wilton had said to me, and I really narrowed it down to the 42 that I identify in the final report.
Interesting. Time will tell if that was good advice. We have some great questions, Kim, from the audience here. I'll start with, can you tell us about your experience at the TRC getting evidence from Canada?
I was just talking on a podcast about that yesterday. Well, it wasn't easy. We had to go to court, as I think most people know. The big fight with Canada at the time was they didn't think that they had to, under the settlement agreement, that they had to pay to digitize the Library and Archives records, the millions and millions of documents that are in Library and Archives Canada. And they were saying, that's the TRC's responsibility with your budget that you have. There's no way that could have happened because of the amount of money. And so we had to go to court. Justice Gouge was our mediator, and lots of back and forth on that, but we ended up being successful. And the thing, I always like to tell people this little story, because at the time, they thought they were going to win. Canada thought they were going to win, and they didn't. And we, when they lost, they had to do their procurement to get a document collection team into the archives. And we already had a team, because we were already going into other archives, church archives. And so I said to the team, the document collection team, we said to Canada, well, we'll just send our team into the archives. And so it was a couple of months before they were able to get a team in there of their own. And I just said immediately to the collection team, get me the Indian hospital records and the RCMP records. And you know, no one was paying attention to us. It was like we were like kids in a candy store trying to get all these records. And then we got kicked out. And so all those records that we collected are at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. But there's a set of RCMP records that we were not able to get. 10,000 RCMP investigations. And we ran out of time before we got kicked out of the archive, and Canada never digitized them and gave them to the National Center. And those files really need to be looked at because we know investigations happened in the Indian residential schools. We know kids ran away and the police were called. We know that there were complaints about sexual and physical abuse and other crimes that happened, and the RCMP would have been called to investigate those or not. And there's this collection that no one can see that are in Library and Archives Canada, and we need to get to them.
Interesting. Okay. Can you, another question from the audience, can you explain a little bit more deeply why this book of evidence is needed in Canada?
I think, my inside voice is saying something very different than what I'm going to say publicly.
We want to hear it. We want to hear it all.
No, I don't want to offend people. I wanted to, as I said, I wanted to make it easier for people that have really busy lives to see the evidence, so that they don't have to try and get into Library and Archives Canada or get into a church archive. I wanted them to see the evidence for themselves because, Murray always used to say, I'll try and say this without crying. Yeah. Murray always used to say, there's three kinds of people in society in Canada. There's our people over here that are with us. They're always going to be with us. They understand. They're historically literate citizens. Then there's this group of people that purposely don't want to be historically literate citizens. They're the deniers. Mm-hmm. A small group of Canadians that are out there putting out disinformation, misinformation, and denying. But he said the majority of people are in the middle. And that's why we need education, and that's why we need to improve our curriculum and in schools and put out information like sites of truth, sites of conscience, to educate that group in the middle, to arm the reasonable. Last time I had lunch with Murray, he reminded me that the whole purpose of the TRC report was to arm the reasonable so that citizens, Canadians can stand with Indigenous people and respond to that small group of denialists that are in Canada.
I think you've touched on this, but I think it's important maybe to come back to. This question is also from the audience. What are the appropriate steps to resolve the scars of the past for those families who are trying to find closure vis-a-vis their loved ones?
Appropriate steps?
Yeah, what are the appropriate steps to resolve the scars? Thank you.
There's many steps that need to happen, and that's part of the reparation-led framework. We have to continue to honor the truth in this country. We need to seek accountability and justice. And lots of the people that were responsible for the crimes against humanity are no longer alive. But that doesn't mean we don't call them out. We don't name them, and we don't identify the crimes that they committed. I have a whole chapter on wellness and the need for Indigenous peoples to have access to proper wellness supports by their own people, and also the importance of interaction between Western medicine practices and Indigenous practices. I heard so many times from elders or survivors that they want to go to their elders. They want to go on the land for healing, but it's not funded by the government. And that they're told they have to go to the Western clinics or hospitals. And so we can't have the healing until the truth is acknowledged by Canada and acknowledged by Canadians as well, because this denying the truth is a barrier to reconciliation, and it's just re-traumatizing communities when they're not believed.
late-breaking question. I don't want to miss it. Did you get an order requiring the RCMP and Archives Canada to preserve the 10,000 plus RCMP records?
No. Someone could do that. No, I did not get an order. It's interesting because I didn't even know that we didn't get those records when we got kicked out. I had thought that we had digitized them. There was a lot of digitizing going on of these records. And no, the TRC never went to court in relation. Canada had the obligation and they were supposed to deliver all these records to us. So once we got kicked out of the archives, they had the obligation by, what the court said they had to do and also what the settlement agreement said they had to do. And there's still, just to get off of Canada for a second, there's also a number of churches that haven't produced their records, didn't produce the records to the TRC, haven't produced the records to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And the Senate recently, last year, held a hearing and brought some church representatives before them, asking them, here we are, 9 years. Why haven't you delivered your records to the National Center? There are some good promising practices, if you will, that have happened. Kamloops signed a covenant with the diocese in their region to open up their records for them to try and identify the children that died and are buried on the grounds. I encourage the denialists to read that covenant because the church makes some acknowledgments in that covenant about the harms they committed. So there's still a lot of records. There's records that were taken over to Europe. There's records that our survivors say are with the Pope at the Vatican. And there's a lot that needs to happen with the records.
I think you just answered this question, but it's very related to what you just shared. So the Catholic entities said they could not pay their $27 million share of the Indian residential school settlement as a best efforts fundraising campaign did not yield sufficient funds. Meanwhile, the Archdiocese of Toronto is spending $280 million to renovate St. Michael's Cathedral.
I know.
What can faith communities do to promote justice and accountability for survivors?
Well, they can do a lot, and I think selling off some of their property to comply with their legal obligation is a good start. Provide their records is another thing that they need to do. The problem we have in Canada is we don't have like the United Church, the Anglican Church, Presbyterian Church, they all have like a head office with a head, someone at the top that can issue directives. We don't have that with the Catholic Church entities. We have the Canadian Council of Catholic Bishops. They issue, I don't even know what to call it, so not a directive, but they issued a memorandum to the diocese encouraging them all to cooperate with Indigenous communities and provide access to their records. They even had a legal opinion done that told the diocese the privacy law doesn't apply to you. The access to information law doesn't apply to you, which is true. Churches are hiding behind those legislations that relate to government records to hide their records. And I write about that in my final report. But not to say there are some good examples where communities have worked very closely with their local diocese to get access to records. But more of that needs to happen. And I just would say also, I write about the rematriation of land, the return of land. And, I think that church entities, the government of Canada did a review of all the Indian residential schools recognized under the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement and the status of the land, whether it was Crown land, reserve land, provincial land, private land. And they did this report. And in the report, they talk about the donut. I think it's so offensive that they call it donut land. But so what we see is we see church land, they call it the donut, which is in the middle of reserve land or crown land. A good example would be in Pine Creek. There's a church in Pine Creek right in the middle of the reserve, right next to where the Indian Residential School was. And I'm like, why is that not First Nations land? How did that church get that land? And so I've said in my final report, It's great that they did this review of the status of the lands, but we need to look at the transfer and the taking of these lands to see if they were, I mean, I'm sure they were all stolen. Maybe I've overstated that. But there needs to be a review of those transfer of those lands. And very few lands have been given back to Indigenous people where the institutions were built on. We have an example in British Columbia, Williams Lake. It was the province that provided over $800,000 to the First Nations so they could buy back their land. You know, and then that wasn't even Canada. It was the province. And so there's no funding, there's no funds from Canada for communities to buy back their land, which also seems ludicrous. You got to buy back your stolen land, and then you got to add it to the reserve so that Canada could be in charge of it again. So there's a big problem with the return of land in this country.
One last question from the audience. What would you leave us with today, Kim, in terms of things that we can do? And that's for the people in the room, the people online. But if there were 1, 2, 3 things that you want us to remember and think about and put in an obligation.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many. Well, first, I hope everyone will read the full report, not just the executive summary. I say that about the TRC all the time, too. Because you're really going to see the voices of the families, and you're going to see the voices of those children. And, you know, I want to remind everyone, these were little kids, right? These were little kids that were taken from their families and communities and placed in these institutions where they died alone without their family members, where they were buried not according to their family's traditions, and never being returned back home to be with their ancestors and with their parents and their grandparents. So I encourage everyone to remember that when you're reading the obligations. And I did a video that I don't know if it's on the website yet. I'm looking at Wendy. So I did a 11-minute video. Please watch it. It's from all the 6 national gatherings that I held up to the closing. And you're going to hear from the families and the communities and survivors directly. In my report, I identify a number of crimes, atrocities that happened that need to be further investigated. I heard, this is not good lunch conversation, but I heard over and over again about babies being killed, being born in the institutions, and being burned in incinerators. That came across the country from different communities. That is something the TRC heard over and over again, and no one has investigated that. So I called for a commission of investigation into missing and disappeared Indigenous children in this country, and suggest that needs to be investigated by that commission. And also, you know, Alika's here, who used to be the head of the Canadian Medical Association. I'm really grateful for the work he did around apology from the Medical Association. Medical experimentation happened. We know that. We now have the National Association recognizing that. I talk a lot about, I have a whole chapter on medical experimentation. These things happened. They happen in this country. This is why you have a special interlocutor for missing children and unmarked graves and burial sites associated with Indian residential schools. And we need to just, you know, stop with the denying, acknowledge it, and let's work together to have proper reparations and move forward with reconciliation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for all of your comments and stories and insights. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you. Oh. Sit down.
Kimberly, thank you for your work and immense leadership on this front, seeking justice for the missing children while forcibly attending Indian residential schools is a heavy task. It's an understatement, especially when the truth can be hard to bear. Thank you for giving voice to the children and families who've been denied that opportunity, and for telling the stories, and for your actionable obligations. We offer you good wishes as you continue on your journey. And Tanya, we appreciate you moderating this important conversation. Thank you for showing up with a huge heart and sharing so bravely about your personal experience on this front. That's pretty significant, so thank you for that. On a bit of a lighter note, I have an apology to make to the TMU table from the dais. I erroneously referred to you as U of T Department of Political Science earlier. Apologies. If you were confused as to whether or not I was talking about you, this is why. Tell Kareem I'm sorry, okay? Before we close, let me remind you to visit our website, canadianclub.org, for upcoming event information. The executive chair of the board of Maple Leaf Foods will be here next Tuesday. Federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh will also be at Canada's podium next week. And I also took note there's a list of our upcoming events on the table for those of you who are keen to join. Lots of great conversations up ahead. Colleen's been hard at work. I'd also like to thank our AV supplier, VVC Live, for contributing to the success of today's conversation, and to each of you for joining here today, for having the courage to be part of this conversation. Thank you for showing up in the way that you have, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.